Have you ever walked into a room full of people who were supposed to love you, and suddenly realized you weren't the guest of honor? You were the joke. That's exactly how my 64th birthday began. But before we continue, my name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 64 years old, a retired accountant, a widow, and until that night, I believed I had raised my children well. I arrived at my daughter Melissa's house a little after 6 in the evening. She insisted on hosting my birthday this year. "Mom, you never let us celebrate you," she said over the phone a week earlier. "This time we're doing it properly." That sentence should have made me happy. Instead, something about it felt strange. But I ignored that feeling. Because when your children want to celebrate you, you don't question it. You show up. So I walked up the front steps carrying a small container of lemon cookies I baked that afternoon. The house was glowing with warm lights, music drifting through the windows. Through the glass door I could see everyone gathered. My son Jordan, 35, standing by the kitchen counter. My younger sister Nancy, 66, laughing loudly. Melissa's husband Greg moving plates around the dining table. Even my grandchildren Lily and Derek were running through the hallway wearing party hats. For a moment I felt something warm in my chest. Maybe Melissa really did want to celebrate me. The door opened before I even knocked. Melissa stood there with a wide smile. "Mom. Happy birthday." She hugged me quickly, the way someone hugs when they're distracted. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the decorations. Balloons. Streamers. A large cake on the dining table. My name written in icing. Eleanor, 64. Everyone looked over. "Hey Mom." Jordan called. "Happy birthday, Ellie," Nancy added. I smiled politely. But something felt off. You know that feeling when people suddenly stop talking when you walk into a room? Like a conversation just ended a second too quickly? That's what it felt like. Greg cleared his throat. Melissa clapped her hands together. "All right everyone, let's sit down before the food gets cold." The dining table was already set. Large plates. Wine glasses. Real silverware. Enough seats for every adult in the room. Melissa turned to me and pointed across the kitchen. "Mom, we saved you a seat." I followed her finger. And that's when I saw it. Not the main table. Not even near the adults. Across the room, near the kitchen counter, was a small folding table. The kids' table. 2 plastic chairs. Colorful paper plates. Juice boxes. My granddaughter Lily and my grandson Derek were already sitting there. I blinked, thinking maybe I misunderstood. But Melissa laughed lightly. "Mom, that seat suits you better." A few people chuckled. Greg smirked. Even Nancy gave an awkward half-laugh. For a moment I just stood there. At my own birthday party. Holding a container of cookies. Looking at the kids' table. Have you ever had a moment where something feels humiliating, but you're not sure if everyone else realizes it? So you pretend it's funny. Just to survive the moment? That's what I did. I smiled. "All right," I said calmly. I walked over to the little table and sat down beside Lily and Derek. The plastic chair creaked slightly under my weight. Derek looked up at me with wide eyes. "Grandma, why are you sitting here?" I smiled at him. "Because this is the fun table." Across the room the adults filled their seats. Wine glasses clinked. Conversation started again. Laughter echoed through the room. But not once did anyone ask me to move to the main table. Not once. And that's when I began noticing the smaller details. Greg leaning toward Melissa, whispering something. Melissa nodding quietly. Jordan staring at his plate like he didn't want to be part of whatever was happening. Nancy glancing at me, then quickly looking away. That uncomfortable feeling in my chest started growing. Because suddenly the kids' table didn't feel like a joke. It felt intentional. Dinner was served. Plates of roasted chicken and vegetables were passed around. Except the kids' table didn't get those plates. We got chicken nuggets, juice boxes, and plastic forks. My own birthday dinner. And I was eating chicken nuggets with my grandchildren. Lily leaned close and whispered something that broke my heart a little. Grandma. Mommy said you like sitting with kids more than grown-ups. I nodded slowly. I suppose she did. But something about that sentence kept echoing in my mind. Mom likes sitting with kids. Not grown-ups. Across the room, Melissa suddenly raised her glass. All right, everyone, I want to make a quick toast. The room quieted. I waited. Maybe this was where things would make sense. Maybe she'd say something kind. Something loving. Instead, Melissa smiled and said, "To new beginnings for our family." Everyone clinked their glasses. But something about that toast had nothing to do with me. Not my birthday. Not my life. Just, new beginnings. And then I heard something that made the room suddenly feel very cold. Greg leaned toward Melissa and whispered quietly. After tonight, we won't have to deal with this anymore. I don't think they meant for me to hear it. But I did. And in that moment a strange calm came over me. Because suddenly a lot of things from the past few months started making sense. The paperwork Melissa asked me to sign. Greg asking questions about the house deed. Jordan mentioning assisted living homes just in case. Little things. Things I brushed off. But now they felt different. Much different. So I reached slowly into my purse. I pulled out my phone. And while everyone was distracted talking and eating, I made a call. When the person answered, I said only one sentence. It's time. Then I hung up. 10 minutes passed. Dinner continued. No one noticed anything. Until the doorbell rang. Melissa frowned. That's strange. She walked to the door. Opened it. And a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. The moment Melissa saw him, her face turned pale. Because she recognized exactly who he was. And suddenly every conversation in the room stopped. What do you do when the person walking into the room isn't just a guest, but someone who can expose everything? That was the moment the air in the house changed. The man standing at the door adjusted his dark suit jacket and stepped inside slowly, calmly, like someone who had been invited and knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Melissa didn't move. For a few seconds she just stood there staring at him. Mr. Hargrove, she said quietly. The entire room went silent. Even the kids stopped talking. From my little plastic chair at the kids' table, I could see every face turning pale one by one. Because Robert Hargrove wasn't a stranger. He was the attorney who handled my late husband Thomas's estate. And everyone in that room knew exactly what that meant. Robert gave Melissa a polite nod. Good evening, Melissa. His voice was calm. Professional. The kind of calm that makes people nervous. Melissa glanced back at the dining table, clearly trying to figure out how to control the situation. Then she forced a tight smile. Mom, why is our lawyer here? I took a slow sip of my juice box before answering. He's not your lawyer, I said quietly. He's mine. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Greg leaned forward, suddenly alert. Jordan looked confused. Nancy looked like she wished she could disappear. Robert stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. Then he looked around the house slowly, taking in the decorations, the cake, the dinner plates, the balloons. A birthday celebration, he said politely. Melissa let out a nervous laugh. Yes, it's Mom's birthday. We were just about to have dessert. Robert nodded. Well, I won't take too long then. He set his briefcase down on the kitchen counter. And the sound of those metal clasps opening echoed through the quiet room like a warning bell. Have you ever watched someone open a briefcase and suddenly realized whatever was inside it might change everything? That's what everyone in that room was thinking. Greg stood up halfway from his chair. Is there a problem here? He asked cautiously. Robert looked at him. That depends. On what? Greg asked. Robert turned slightly and looked directly at me. On whether Mrs. Brooks would like to address something with the family first. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me. Still sitting at the kids' table. Holding a juice box. For a second nobody moved. Then Melissa crossed her arms. Mom, she said sharply, what exactly is going on? I stood up slowly. The small plastic chair scraped lightly against the floor. I smoothed my sweater and walked toward the main dining table. You could feel the tension building with every step. The same people who had just laughed at me sitting with the children were now staring at me like they were trying to read my mind. I stopped beside the table. Not sitting down. Just standing there. Looking at each of them. Before dessert, I said calmly, I think we need to clear something up. Greg shifted in his seat. Jordan leaned forward. Melissa let out a sigh of frustration. Oh my God, Mom, if this is about the seating thing. It's not, I said. That shut her up. Robert pulled a folder from his briefcase. Thick. Organized. Prepared. He placed it gently on the table. The sound made Greg swallow hard. Melissa tried to laugh again. You called a lawyer to your own birthday party? I looked at her. No, I said quietly. I called him because of something you tried to do. Now the room was truly silent. Jordan frowned. What do you mean? I glanced at Robert and nodded. He opened the folder. Inside were several documents. Carefully marked with tabs. 2 months ago, Robert began calmly, Mrs. Brooks was asked to sign paperwork involving the transfer of residential property. Greg's chair creaked slightly. Melissa's face stiffened. Jordan looked confused. What paperwork? He asked. Robert slid one of the documents across the table. The paper stopped directly in front of Melissa. She didn't touch it. But she knew exactly what it was. Melissa, Robert continued, would you like to explain this document to the family? Melissa's mouth opened. Then closed again. Greg quickly jumped in. It was just routine paperwork, he said. Insurance updates. Robert tilted his head slightly. Is that so? He tapped the document lightly. Because this paperwork does not update insurance. He paused. Then looked around the room. It transfers ownership of the Brooks residence. The room froze. Jordan's head snapped toward Melissa. What? Nancy gasped quietly. Greg leaned forward defensively. Hold on. Robert finished the sentence calmly. From Eleanor Brooks, to Melissa Brooks and Gregory Brooks. Now the silence felt heavier. Melissa's cheeks turned red. That's not. But Robert wasn't finished. Effective immediately upon signature. Jordan pushed his chair back slightly. Wait, he said. You tried to transfer Mom's house? Melissa stood up suddenly. It wasn't like that. Everyone started talking at once. Nancy whispering. Greg trying to interrupt. Jordan demanding answers. But I didn't say a word. I just watched. Because this exact moment, was the moment the truth finally started coming out. And they hadn't even heard the worst part yet. Robert calmly closed the folder again. Then he looked at Melissa and Greg. There is, however, another document Mrs. Brooks asked me to bring tonight. Melissa slowly sat back down. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What document? Robert placed a second folder on the table. and said one sentence that made Greg go completely pale. The updated will. Why would someone update their will and reveal it in the middle of their own birthday party? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The second Robert placed that folder on the table, every person in the room understood something important. This was no longer a birthday celebration. This was a reckoning. Melissa stared at the folder like it might explode. Greg leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck, trying to look calm but failing miserably. Jordan looked between all of us, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. "Mom," he said slowly, "why are we talking about your will tonight?" Good question. Maybe you're wondering the same thing. Why would a 64-year-old woman bring her lawyer to dinner and talk about inheritance before dessert? The answer is simple. Because sometimes the only way to make people understand what they've done is to show them the consequences while they're still sitting at the table. Robert adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. Melissa immediately stood up again. "No. Absolutely not," she said. "This is ridiculous." Greg grabbed her arm lightly. "Sit down," he whispered. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself back into the chair. Robert spoke calmly. For context, Mrs. Brooks originally created her will 4 years ago after the passing of her husband, Thomas Brooks. Jordan nodded slightly. "I remember that." At that time, Robert continued, the primary asset in the estate, the Brooks family home, was to be divided equally between her 2 children, Melissa Brooks and Jordan Brooks. Jordan looked relieved. Melissa looked smug. For a brief moment. Then Robert continued speaking. However, several recent developments caused Mrs. Brooks to reconsider that arrangement. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Mom. You're being dramatic." I looked at her. "No," I said quietly. "I'm being careful." Greg crossed his arms. "So what exactly is the point of this little performance?" Robert answered before I could. "The point is clarity." He slid another document onto the table. "Because Mrs. Brooks learned something troubling." Melissa scoffed. "Here we go." Robert ignored her. Specifically, that Melissa Brooks and Gregory Brooks had already consulted a real estate agent regarding the potential sale of the Brooks residence. The reaction was immediate. Jordan's chair scraped across the floor. "You what?" Nancy covered her mouth. Greg sat up straight. "Hold on," he snapped. "That was just a conversation." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Was it?" He pulled another sheet from the folder. A printed email. He slid it across the table. Greg glanced at it. Then immediately looked away. Jordan grabbed the paper and started reading. His face changed instantly. "You told this realtor the house would be available within 60 days, he said." Melissa jumped in quickly. "That was hypothetical." Jordan looked at her like he didn't recognize her. "You don't hypothetically sell Mom's house." The tension in the room was thick now. Lily and Derek were watching quietly from the kids' table, sensing something serious was happening. I walked slowly to the dining table and rested my hands on the back of an empty chair. Still not sitting down. Just observing. Melissa turned toward me. "Mom, you're blowing this completely out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked calmly. "Yes," she snapped. "We were just planning ahead." Greg nodded quickly. "Exactly. Eventually you're going to want a smaller place anyway." Have you ever heard someone explain your future to you, like it's already been decided? That's what that felt like. I looked at Greg. "Interesting," I said quietly. "When exactly did I say I wanted to leave my house?" Greg opened his mouth. Then stopped. Melissa jumped in again. "Well, you're not getting younger." Nancy let out a small gasp. Even Jordan looked shocked. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply asked one question. So you decided the solution was to transfer the house to yourselves? Melissa slammed her hand on the table. It was going to stay in the family. Robert spoke calmly again. That is not what the document states. He tapped the page. This transfer would have given Melissa and Gregory full ownership rights. Greg's jaw tightened. And? Robert continued. Which means Mrs. Brooks could legally be asked to vacate the property at any time. That was the moment the room truly erupted. Jordan stood up. You were going to kick Mom out of her own house? Melissa shouted back. We weren't going to kick her out. Then what were you planning to do? Jordan demanded. No answer came. Just silence. Because suddenly the truth was sitting in the middle of the table. Ugly. Unavoidable. And impossible to spin. I finally pulled out the chair and sat down. Not at the kids' table this time. At the main table. Directly across from Melissa. I didn't say anything for months, I told them calmly. I watched. I listened. I waited. Melissa looked furious. So what? This is revenge? I shook my head slowly. No. I nodded toward Robert. This is protection. Robert opened the second document fully. The revised estate plan, he said. Everyone went quiet again. Jordan sat slowly. Nancy leaned forward. Greg looked tense. Melissa folded her arms, glaring at me. Robert began reading. As of last week, the Brooks residence will no longer be inherited directly by any adult beneficiary. Melissa blinked. What? Robert continued. The property will instead be placed into a protected family trust. Jordan frowned. A trust? Robert nodded. Yes. He turned the page. And the beneficiaries of that trust are. He paused. Then looked toward the kids' table. Lily Brooks and Derek Brooks. Melissa's face turned white. Because she suddenly realized something terrifying. She had just lost control of the house she thought she was about to own. But Robert wasn't finished. He looked back down at the document. And there is one additional clause Mrs. Brooks insisted on adding. Greg leaned forward nervously. What clause? Robert closed the folder slowly. And said the sentence that made Melissa's hands start shaking. Melissa Brooks and Gregory Brooks must vacate the residence within 60 days. What happens when someone finally realizes the plan they built for months just collapsed in a single sentence? That was the exact moment Melissa stopped breathing. Not literally, of course. But the look on her face told the whole story. For months she believed the house was slowly becoming hers. She believed she was steering things in that direction, carefully, patiently, quietly. And now, sitting at the dining table during what was supposed to be my birthday dinner, she had just learned the opposite was happening. 60 days, she repeated slowly. The room was silent again. Even the music playing softly from the kitchen speaker seemed to fade into the background. Greg leaned forward immediately. Now hold on a second, he said. Robert didn't raise his voice. But he didn't back down either. Mr. Brooks, the legal notice is very clear. He slid a printed document across the table. Greg didn't touch it. He just stared at it. Jordan looked between all of us like he was watching something he couldn't believe was real. Mom, he said quietly, is this serious? I looked at him. Do you think I would bring a lawyer to dinner if it wasn't? That shut him up. Melissa suddenly stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. This is insane, she shouted. Her voice echoed through the house. Lily and Derek flinched at the kids' table. Greg grabbed Melissa's arm. Relax, he whispered. But she shook him off. No. I'm not relaxing. She turned toward me, her face flushed with anger. You're throwing your own daughter out of her home. That sentence hung in the air. And it said everything. Her home. Not mine. Her home. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her carefully. Melissa, I said calmly, whose name is on the deed? She didn't answer. Greg muttered something under his breath. Jordan rubbed his forehead. Nancy shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Robert answered the question for her. The Brooks residence is owned entirely by Eleanor Brooks. Melissa laughed bitterly. Technically, maybe. Technically. Isn't it interesting how people suddenly start talking about technicalities when the facts stop working in their favor? I folded my hands on the table. You moved in because Greg lost his job, I said. Melissa opened her mouth, but I continued. You said it would be temporary. 3 years. 3 years had passed since that conversation. 3 years of groceries. Utilities. Repairs. 3 years of me living quietly in the same house I bought with my husband 37 years ago, while slowly becoming a guest in it. Jordan finally spoke. Melissa, is it true you talked to a realtor? She looked at him like she'd just been betrayed. Whose side are you on? That's not what I asked, Jordan replied. Greg leaned forward. We were exploring options, he said defensively. Robert nodded calmly. Yes. Options that required Mrs. Brooks to unknowingly transfer ownership of her home. Greg's jaw tightened. That's not how it was. Robert lifted the document again. The wording suggests otherwise. Melissa slammed her hand on the table. You set us up. I raised an eyebrow. How? You knew about the paperwork. Yes, I said. And instead of confronting you immediately, you decided to humiliate us tonight? Humiliate. That word caught my attention. Because just an hour earlier, I had been sitting at a plastic kids' table eating chicken nuggets. At my own birthday party. I looked at Melissa. Do you remember where you told me to sit tonight? She froze. The room got quiet again. The kids' table, I continued. You said the seat suited me better. Melissa looked away. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Jordan lowered his eyes. Nancy stared at the tablecloth. That moment, I said softly, told me everything I needed to know. Because respect doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades slowly. Little comments. Little decisions. Little humiliations that people think you won't notice. Until one day you realize something very simple. You're not being included anymore. You're being managed. Melissa crossed her arms again. So that's it, she said bitterly. You're punishing us because of a seating joke? I shook my head. No. I leaned slightly forward. I'm protecting myself from the future you were planning. Greg stood up now. His voice was tense. Where exactly do you expect us to go? Good question. But also a revealing one. Because notice something interesting. He didn't ask why. He asked where. Robert answered calmly. The notice provides 60 days to secure alternative housing. Greg scoffed. That's not enough time. Jordan spoke quietly. You've had 3 years. That shut Greg up. Melissa turned toward Jordan again. Wow, she said. So you're just siding with Mom now? Jordan shook his head. I'm siding with reality. Nancy finally spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Melissa, you can't try to take someone's house and then act shocked when they stop trusting you. Melissa looked around the room like the ground had suddenly shifted beneath her. Because for the first time that night, the room was no longer on her side. But the night wasn't finished yet. Robert still had one more document in his briefcase. And when he reached inside and pulled it out, Greg's face turned even paler. Because whatever was in that envelope, it meant this situation was about to become much bigger than a family argument. Have you ever watched someone open an envelope and suddenly felt like the room got 10 degrees colder? That's what happened when Robert reached into his briefcase again. Up until that moment, everyone thought the worst had already been said. The house. The will. The 60-day notice. But Robert wasn't finished. He placed a large sealed envelope on the dining table. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just carefully. And sometimes the quietest actions are the ones that make people the most nervous. Greg stared at it immediately. "What's that?" he asked. Robert looked at him. "Something Mrs. Brooks asked me to prepare in case tonight became complicated." Melissa threw her hands up. "Oh, for God's sake." She turned toward me. "What else could you possibly have planned?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked toward the kids' table. Lily and Derek were watching the adults very carefully now. Children always know when something serious is happening, even if they don't understand the details. "Why don't you two take the cake into the living room?" I said gently. "Start dessert without us." Lily hesitated. "But Grandma." "It's okay," I said with a small smile. "Go on." Jordan stood and helped them carry the cake away. The moment they disappeared down the hallway, the tension at the table returned immediately. Melissa leaned forward. "All right," she said. "What's in the envelope?" Robert didn't answer her. He looked at me. "Mrs. Brooks, would you like me to proceed?" I nodded once. Robert opened the envelope. Inside were several stapled pages. He slid the first one across the table. Directly toward Greg. Greg glanced down. Then froze. For the first time that night, he didn't have anything sarcastic to say. Jordan noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Greg didn't respond. Melissa snatched the paper out of Greg's hands. She read the first few lines. And her entire expression changed. "What is this?" Robert answered calmly. "A record of financial transactions." Melissa looked up sharply. "What transactions?" Robert tapped the document. Over the past 18 months, several payments associated with the Brooks residence were redirected from Mrs. Brooks' accounts. Now the room went silent again. Jordan frowned. "What do you mean redirected?" Robert turned another page. Utility bills. Maintenance payments. Property tax notifications. Greg shifted in his seat. Melissa looked confused. "So?" Robert spoke evenly. "These payments were altered to route through a secondary account." He paused. "And that account belongs to Gregory Brooks." Greg stood up suddenly. "That's ridiculous." Robert didn't raise his voice. But he continued speaking. "The records show the changes were made online using Mrs. Brooks' home computer." Now Jordan looked confused. "Mom doesn't even use online banking." "Exactly. That was the point." Melissa slowly looked toward Greg. "What is he talking about?" Greg shook his head quickly. "This is nonsense." But Robert calmly slid another page across the table. Printed login records. Dates. Times. IP addresses. "Mr. Brooks," Robert said, "these records show repeated access to Mrs. Brooks' accounts during hours she was not home." Greg's face tightened. Melissa's voice got quieter. "You told me those payments were just being reorganized." Greg didn't answer. Jordan stared at him. "You were using Mom's accounts?" Greg rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't like that." Robert corrected him. "The financial changes transferred responsibility for certain bills to accounts Mr. Brooks controlled." Nancy gasped. "Greg, were you taking money?" Greg snapped back immediately. "I wasn't taking anything." But his voice sounded thinner now. More defensive. Robert calmly continued. "The concern is not only the redirection of payments. He turned another page. There were also attempted access requests related to the property deed. Now Melissa looked genuinely confused. Greg. What is he talking about? Greg didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the documents like they might disappear. Have you ever watched someone realize that the story they told everyone isn't matching the evidence anymore? That's what this looked like. Jordan slowly pushed his chair back. You were messing with Mom's accounts, he said. Greg looked at him. I was fixing things. Fixing what? Jordan asked. Greg exhaled sharply. The house is falling apart financially. That caught everyone off guard. Melissa blinked. What? Greg ran a hand through his hair. The taxes keep going up. Repairs keep coming up. The place needs money. Robert spoke calmly again. Which does not explain accessing accounts that were not yours. Greg's voice got louder. I was trying to manage things. Melissa stared at him. You told me everything was under control. Greg didn't answer. And that silence said more than any explanation could. I leaned back in my chair. Watching. Listening. Because something interesting had just happened. The conversation was no longer about me. Or the house. Now the family was starting to see something else entirely. And the deeper the truth started coming out, the more uncomfortable the room became. But Robert hadn't finished explaining the envelope yet. He placed one final sheet on the table. And the moment Jordan read the heading, his eyes widened. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something that could bring consequences none of them had expected.